and a question comes up on a topic that you haven't studied for, again, you're going to be stuck. I don't want to say any more about that other than to say there's been a lot of communications, official communications about what you can expect from exams, from Ricardo, from Wouter, and from the school. So refer to those if you have any questions. Okay, so this is an overview now of the actual topics that we're going to cover in this series of videos. So the video has been broken up into 4 sections, which mirror the kind of 4 sections into which the work has been, or the material has been divided. So the first section is about inflation 3, and then when we move on to a key limits to the stabilization policies that we just discussed. Okay, so moving on to the content. Week 1, all about inflation in the central bank. So this is really a key week for framing a lot of our discussion about how nominal variables and real variables are going to interact in the macroeconomy. So this is going to be important for week 1, week 2, also week 3, and then when we move on to weeks 6, 7, and 8, and we start thinking about business cycles and stabilization policy. So in week 1, there's really 2 key questions that we're trying to answer. The first question is, how are short-term interest rates determined? And this is going to be of interest because we're going to see that short-term interest rates are really going to be the key policy tool that central banks have traditionally used to achieve their macroeconomic objectives. So we're going to think about how does the central bank influence this policy tool? And then the second question is going to be, how does changes in these short-term interest rates cause changes in inflation, or how is it going to be linked to changes in inflation, which is the central bank's ultimate policy objective to control inflation. Okay, so to answer the first question about how short-term interest rates are determined, the key graph or the key diagram that you want to understand is this graph that shows the reserve market. So in some ways it's a very familiar graph. It's a graph that shows equilibrium in a market where you can see quantities and prices, and we have a supply curve and a demand curve. Okay, so in this sense, this is a very kind of familiar diagram that you would have seen in micro. There are some important differences, and my discussion here is just going to be focusing on highlighting these differences that might be causing you some trouble. Okay, so first question is going to be, what's our quantity? Well, it's a market for reserves. So on the horizontal axis, we're going to have the quantity of reserves. I think that's self-explanatory. The next bit that might be a bit trickier is, what is the price of these reserves? So the price of the reserves is going to be given by the interbank rate. And in particular, you should think about it in the following way. So this is going to be easiest if we think about the demand curve, or most relevant if we think about the demand curve. So suppose you are a commercial bank and you wish to borrow reserves in order to hold additional reserves in your own account with the central bank. What's going to be the cost of holding those reserves in your account? Well, it's going to be whatever the interbank rate is. So in this equilibrium, let's say the interbank rate was 4% and the deposit rate, let's say, was 2%. So what's going to be the borrowing cost of borrowing reserves from another bank and holding them in my own account? Well, I'm going to have to pay 4% to borrow those reserves from the other bank in the interbank market. I'm going to get 2% for holding those reserves in my own account. So my net borrowing cost, or the net cost of demanding these reserves and holding them myself, is going to be 2%. So what you should see is that for a fixed deposit rate, as the interbank rate goes up, the cost of borrowing those reserves is also going to go up. Hence, the price of demanding those reserves goes up. And what's going to happen? You are going to demand fewer reserves intuitively. We'll come back in a second to why exactly is going to be this relationship between the price of reserves and demanding fewer, or how much you demand of them. But for now, that should be intuitive. If you are a lender of reserves, this gap between the lending rate and the deposit rate is still going to be the cost of holding reserves, but now it's going to be an opportunity cost, right? So if you have all the reserves you need as a bank and you could potentially lend them out, what's going to happen? Well, if you keep them, you get 2%. If you lend them out, you get 4%. So the difference between these two is essentially what you are losing by demanding the reserves, i.e. holding them in your own account and not lending them out. Okay, so either way, the gap between the interbank rate and the deposit rate is going to be the cost of demanding reserves. So that's why this vertical axis represents the price of reserves. So the next thing to talk about is, why is this demand curve downward sloping? So if it's downward sloping, what does it say? It says when the interbank rate goes up, and therefore the gap between the interbank rate and the deposit rate goes up, that means that the quantity demanded of reserves goes down. How can we justify that? Well, you might ask, why would any bank want to hold reserves when the interbank rate is higher than the deposit rate? Why are you paying this price of holding reserves? And the key thing to remember here is that reserves play this special role in the economy in that they are the best form of liquidity. Okay, so you're willing to pay a liquidity premium and hold an asset that essentially doesn't give you a very high return, because it can always be used immediately to settle payments and to settle claims without any difficulties. So commercial banks are willing to pay this liquidity premium and hold reserves, i.e. demand reserves. However, their willingness to do this is going to be decreasing as the cost of holding reserves increases. So that's why we have a downward sloping demand curve. And then the final key thing to remember from this downward sloping demand curve is going to be to think about why this demand curve is eventually going to become horizontal. So at this point here, when the interbank rate equals the deposit rate, what are we going to have? We're going to have a perfectly elastic demand for reserves. Okay, so at this point, banks are going to be indifferent between holding, let's call it QS, and any amount of reserves above QS. Okay, why is that the case? Well, when the interbank rate equals the deposit rate, that's the same thing as saying there's no gap between the two. Sorry, I'm going to call that just for shorthand. Okay, so the gap between the two is going to be zero. So there's going to be no opportunity cost holding reserves, which means that essentially banks can hold all the liquidity they need in terms of these reserves. So QS is going to be, in this notation, the amount of reserves they need to fully satisfy all their liquidity requirements. And then banks are also going to be willing to hold additional reserves beyond what they need for the liquidity requirements, because there's no opportunity cost holding reserves, reserves are as good as any other kind of financial asset in some sense. So they're willing to hold additional reserves just for the ordinary reasons that you would hold other financial assets. Okay. And then the final thing that we want to discuss with this reserve market is this supply curve of reserves. And the key thing here to remember is that the supply curve of reserves is drawn as a vertical line. Why? Because we're assuming that, or not assuming, this is kind of more or less what happens, that the central bank, as the monopoly issuer of reserves, is the one controlling the supply of reserves in the market. And therefore, the supply of reserves is determined exogenously, i.e. outside of the market, and in particular is not responding to the interbank rate. So how is the central bank going to decide how it wants to set the supply of reserves? Well, under the previous monetary policy system, which we called a corridor system, i.e. when the supply of reserves was at a point where, so I'll just draw a new supply curve just so we can move it around. So when the supply of reserves is anywhere before this satiation point, so anywhere in this region here, this is what we call a corridor system. And what happens in this system is that the central bank, remember their ultimate goal is to try and control the short-term interest rate, i.e. the interbank rate. How are they going to achieve this? Well, suppose this is the world we're in, and the central bank decides it needs to stimulate the economy. In order to do so, it needs to lower interest rates. What are they going to do? They're going to increase the supply of reserves. And from the market equilibrium, this is going to push down the equilibrium interest rate in the market. So that's a corridor system, which is how monetary policy was conducted in previous decades. Now, however, following a number of unconventional monetary policies, the supply of reserves has been expanded so far that we're at this point here, somewhere, which is past that satiation point I spoke about, in which case we're in a floor system. When we're in a floor system, what do we say? The interbank rate is simply equal to the deposit rate, which is the rate of interest that the central bank pays commercial banks for holding reserves in their accounts with the central bank. And now, as you move the supply of reserves, what you should see is that this does not affect the interbank rate. So in a floor system, the only way to change the interbank rate is to change the deposit rate. So if you increase the deposit rate, that will increase the interbank rate or short-term nominal interest rates 1-for-1. Okay, so that's basically our answer to how are short-term interest rates determined. They're determined through the reserve market. In a corridor system, they're determined by the position of the supply curve for reserves relative to the demand curve. In a floor system, they're determined by the deposit rate set by the central bank. So this graph just illustrates that point. So before this period here, sorry, let me try to get this right. So we have kind of two periods. So we have the corridor period to the left and then the floor period to the right. Okay, so what do you see from the corridor period? That the central bank's lending rate and deposit rate, so the ceiling and the floor, provided a corridor within which the interbank rate fluctuated. And then at some point when the kind of corridor was squeezed all the way, or another way of saying that is when this supply curve of reserves was pushed all the way out here, then we went into a floor system in which the interbank rate was essentially just the deposit rate. Okay. So that's basically a discussion of how the short-term interest rate is set by the central bank. But remember that, sorry, I should say rather than set, it's a discussion of how the short-term interest rate is influenced by the central bank. It's ultimately set in the market. In a corridor system, in a floor system, it's essentially set by the central bank. The question is, however, why does the central bank care about moving around this short-term interest rate? So to understand that, we need to remember that one of the central bank's key objectives, if not their primary objective, is to control inflation. So the reason they're going to be moving interest rates around is in order to keep inflation on target. So how can we see this link between interest rates and inflation? Well, remember we have a long-run perspective and a short-run perspective. So in the long run, the link is very simple. All we need is the Fisher equation. So remember, in the long run, we have the so-called classical dichotomy, which tells us that changes in nominal variables will not affect real variables. Okay. So another way of saying this is, in the long run, monetary policy, which is all about nominal variables, can do nothing to affect the real interest rate. So I'm going to put a bar over here. We've used a bar for different things, but here I'm just going to use a bar to say the real interest rate in the long run is fixed. Okay. or fixed with respect to monetary policy changes. Another key property of the long run, which is related to what I just said, is that actuals and expectations should align. So expected inflation, actual inflation should on average coincide. So what does this tell us? In the long run, if monetary policy is setting a higher nominal interest rate on average, given that the real interest rate is fixed, that implies higher expected inflation 1-for-1 and therefore higher actual inflation 1-for-1 on average. Okay, so that's interest rates and inflation in the long run. Higher nominal interest rates go with higher inflation. Why? Because the real interest rate is fixed with respect to nominal interest rate. Expected inflation must therefore adjust, causing actual inflation to adjust. Okay. In the short run, the story is slightly different and almost counterintuitively is going to work in the opposite direction when we think about the relationship between nominal interest rates and inflation. So in the short run, it's going to be a bit more complicated. We're going to have to use the Fisher equation, the kind of reduced form Phillips curve that Ricardo gave you in the lectures, or he might have given it a slightly different name. But the equation linking inflation and real interest rates, the policy rule, and a function that tells us how inflation expectations are formed. And if you combine all those equations, you basically just have a linear system of equations with an equal number of equations unknowns, so you can solve for all of your unknowns. One of them, and the key one here, being inflation. And you can get this equation from the lecture slides, which shows you how inflation varies as a function of different exogenous variables and parameters. And one of the key insights, the one that I want to emphasize here, is that when we raise I hat, so this is thought of as a short-run tightening of monetary policy, i.e. a short-run increase in nominal interest rates, what we see is that because there's a negative sign in front of the I hat, that causes a decrease in inflation. So we get the opposite to what we had in the long run. And remember, the key thing here is that in the short run, we are taking inflation expectations to be fixed with respect to the short-run nominal interest rate. So nominal interest rate goes up in the short run. That causes the real interest rate to go up. And then through this Phillips curve equation, what we see is that when real interest rate goes up, that essentially dampens demand in the economy and pushes inflation down. And then there's a number of other kind of key policy lessons, in particular 4 of them that Ricardo highlights in the notes, but that's what I wanted to cover here. Okay, so moving on to week 2 and the unconventional monetary policy and hyperinflations. So week 1 is all about conventional monetary policy. What happens in a kind of so-called normal central bank under normal circumstances in a typical kind of major economy. Now we're going to think about what happens in week 2 when monetary policy cannot operate in this conventional way for one of 2 reasons. So the first reason we're going to think about is what happens when the normal policy tool, the short-run nominal interest rate that we've been speaking about, cannot be adjusted. What can we do then? And that leads to the unconventional monetary policy discussion. And then point 2 is what happens when we have this, you could think about it as a shortcoming in the political system or a political economy issue where the government is kind of being naughty and is relying upon the central bank to generate revenue through seigniorage rather than generating revenue itself through taxation. And this is, we're going to see, is going to lead to hyperinflations. So in terms of the unconventional monetary policy discussion, so this is all motivated by the fact that, as you can see in this period, post-financial crisis, short-run nominal interest rates went all the way down to essentially 0. And for a number of reasons that Ricardo's touched upon in the lectures, there's essentially a 0 lower bound, or some people talk about an effective lower bound, which tells us that at some point you can't keep pushing down short-run nominal interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. And that leads to a problem for central banks, right? That kind of means that the usual way of dealing with a recession, low output, low inflation, or a demand-side recession, cannot be used anymore. And you got to think about unconventional monetary policy tools to address this issue. So suppose in particular that inflation is too low. but that your short-run nominal interest rate is essentially at zero. What can you do? Well, you can start looking at longer-term interest rates. So not just interest rates on overnight borrowing or borrowing for short periods, but interest rates for borrowing for 1 year, 5 year, 10 years into the future. So to understand how this is all going to work, first you want to think about how are these longer term interest rates determined. So remember we spoke about how short run interest rates were determined with that reserve market diagram. Longer run interest rates are going to be determined basically by thinking about a no arbitrage condition that has to hold across bonds or financial assets of different maturities. So in particular, if we do our typical log approximations and we assume some kind of risk neutrality or an absence of risk in financial markets, then we can get this equation here, which tells us that the nominal yield on an in-period bond has to be equal to the average of the current short-term yield on a one-period bond and what you expect all of those future yields on one-period bonds to be between now and the period in which this in-period bond is going to mature. So basically, what are we saying here? Well, we're saying that in expectation, the return from investing or the yield from investing in an in-period bond should be the same as the expected yield from investing in one-period bonds between now and that nth period. So hopefully that's intuitive, but this leads us to a very important point. So before we get there, this is just a graphical representation of what we call the yield curve. So this shows us yields at different maturities. So you can think about this as being, so at this point here, so this is like IT, I don't know, 8 if the time period is measured in months, and then this gives you, I don't know, like IT 55, for example. Okay, so this is just a graphical representation of all these different yields at different maturities, which from this no arbitrage condition, we know essentially should be linked to current and future expectations of all the short-term nominal interest rates. So why does this matter? Well, we can see this if we just consider a situation in which investors are considering whether they invest in a one-period nominal bond or a two-period nominal bond. So for now, just ignore this bit. So this is what we had on the previous slide, but just applied to a two-period bond. So nominal returns or nominal yields on a two-period bond should be approximately equal to the short-term interest rate plus what you expect the short-term interest rate to be in the next period. This implies that in expectation, you're getting the same return whether you're investing in a two-period bond or two one-period bonds. If we account for the fact, however, that investors may not be risk neutral or financial markets may be imperfect, we also have to account for the fact that each of these different investment strategies, the two-period bond strategy and the two one-period bond strategy, have different risk profiles, and you have to add this kind of risk premium for investing your money for 2 periods when maybe you might need to pull it out sooner because of liquidity issues, or maybe you might be worried about default of the person you lend to. But either way, we add this term premium. So now we've expressed long-term interest rates as a function of the current short-term interest rate, the expected future short-term interest rate, and this term premium. So this is going to give us a framework now for thinking about unconventional monetary policies. So the issue here is what happens when the short-term nominal interest rate is approximately zero. So you've pushed that down as far as possible in order to raise inflation back to target. You haven't fully succeeded, so you need to try something else. So what are you trying to do now? Well, your aim now is going to be to push down long-term interest rates to further stimulate the economy. You can't push down short-term interest rates any further. Those are already zero. So now there's kind of two types of unconventional monetary policy you could do. One is use forward guidance, which says push down expectations of future short-term rates in order to push down long-term rates today. The other is to use QE, which says buy a whole bunch of these 2-period government bonds, and in doing so, push down the term premium on these bonds, which will push down the current long-term rate. Either way, you're pushing down current long-term rates, which is going to stimulate the economy and push inflation back up towards target. So this is just a visual representation of these unconventional monetary policies and conventional monetary policies in, I think it's a euro area, I may be wrong, but this is taken from your lecture slides between the period of 2008 and 2019. So conventional monetary policy is just this bit here, right? So it's just the fact that you've pushed down the short end of the yield curve as far as it will go down. Unconventional monetary policy is the fact that you've also done this bit here, which is you've flattened the long end of the yield curve. Okay, so at some point when the short-term interest rate is around zero or just below zero, you can't push that down anymore, and you have to start focusing on these unconventional policies, either by doing forward guidance and or quantitative easing. Okay, and then the second kind of theme in week 2 is about hyperinflation. This is slightly different. So this is thinking about when monetary policy gets, you can think about it being unconventional in a different way. So this is monetary policy finding different ways to do what it should have been doing anyway, which is controlling inflation. This is now going to be about monetary policy doing things it wasn't designed to do. Okay, so in week 1, we thought about monetary policy in terms of the nominal interest rate. Now we're going to think about monetary policy in terms of the money supply, which is maybe how you were already used to thinking about monetary policy before. Why do we do that? Well, first of all, the key thing to remember here is that we are now going to be considering an environment in which the objective of the central bank isn't necessarily just to control inflation, but they might have other objectives put on them by the government. And in particular, they're going to be trying to maximize revenue collection for the government. How are they going to do that? Well, they're going to generate seigniorage revenues by printing a whole bunch of money and buying stuff, essentially. So what's going to be our kind of theory or theoretical framework for organizing our thoughts about this? Well, we're going to use this quantity equation here in levels. This is just an accounting identity. And then we're going to take logs and differentiate, and we're going to get the same equation in growth rates. And this is now going to give us a link between current inflation, current monetary policy in terms of the growth rate of the money supply, and future monetary policy to the extent that it affects people's expectations of how inflation will evolve. So the key thing here now is that, remember, this is going to be the monetary policy tool. So if the growth rate of the money supply is very high, or if it increases, this is going to push up inflation. Similarly, if people expect future money supply growth to be high, that's going to cause expectations of inflation to increase, which will also increase inflation. Remember, the key thing here is that even though, so this inflation is clearly a monetary phenomenon, so driven by current money printing or future money printing, the root causes are fiscal. Okay, so the key thing is, why is the central bank engaging in this seemingly very destructive behavior? Well, there's fiscal pressure in order to collect seigniorage revenues, so they kind of have to do this. Okay, so that's a summary of what's going on with the hyperinflation stuff. And then the last point that I just wanted to emphasize was also take a look in week 2 at the central bank balance sheets. A, because it's useful for this course in general to understand how to read the basics of the balance sheet, and B, knowing how the central bank balance sheet works, again, at a fairly basic level, gives you quite a good insight into a lot of the material. Okay, that's it for part 1 of this video series, and part 2 will continue with the second section, which looks at financial markets.